Good morning, Senator Cruz. Welcome to the New York Sun.
Great to be with you.
Thank you. I want to start off, we endorsed you for Republican nomination for president in 2016 before the New York primary.
Thank you.
Large part because of your support for sound money and the gold standard and scrutiny of the Fed. Can you talk to us a little bit about where does that fight stand now? Is that
Yeah.
a fight you're still invested in? And what are the updates from the gold front line?
Look, if you look at the Fed, it continues to be more and more unaccountable. For a long time, I've been fighting for legislation to audit the Fed. It's not even clear what is on their balance books and what's not. The Fed behaves as if it answers to nobody. And we had years of quantitative easing. And now, in the face of the fiscal spending explosion, particularly over the last 2 years with a Democrat Congress and a Democrat White House, we're seeing the consequences of that. We're seeing inflation rising across the economy. I think we need the Fed tethered to stability, not trying to focus on trying to juice the economy one way or the other, but rather the Fed's mandate should be monetary stability. That's the advantage of something like a gold standard, is that it focuses on keeping inflation under control and providing a stable currency for the rest of the economy to utilize. I think we've also seen in the wake of things like the Silicon Valley Bank bailout, that number one, the San Francisco Fed was the primary regulator of Silicon Valley Bank, and they were, by all appearances, asleep at the switch. The challenges in terms of SVB's balance sheets were obvious to see. The interest rate exposure they had was not obscure or hidden. Now, Silicon Valley Bank, for a year, didn't have a chief risk officer. That they were very focused on ESG priorities, on demonstrating that they were politically to the left on everything, but they didn't actually focus on their own risk exposure. And it appears San Francisco Fed wasn't doing its job. And I've joined with Jim Jordan in exercising congressional oversight over the San Francisco Fed. What did they know and when did they know it? Now, I'll tell you, the branch offices of the Fed historically have been incredibly resistant to any congressional oversight, and you may be shocked to hear it, but I actually have joined with Elizabeth Warren, someone I rarely make common cause with, but on legislation to make the branch offices of the Fed subject to FOIA so that you have transparency and oversight in terms of what they're doing.
So given the inflationary crisis, broader instability in the economy, your sort of support for the gold standard feels like maybe it's an idea whose time has come, an old idea who's now in the sun again. Is that sort of your read, that this is a moment for kind of new possibilities in terms of Congress reassessing its role in the economy and putting some heat on the Fed?
Well, look, I think with a Democrat administration and a Democrat majority in the Senate, we're not going to see sound monetary policy coming out because today's Democrats don't want sound monetary policy. They want to print money to their heart's content. They've never seen $1 trillion they didn't love. And you look at, if you just look from 2017 to today, in 2017, the national debt was just over $20 billion. Now we're at $32 trillion. That's 5.5 years later. That is a massive increase. In order for us to have meaningful scrutiny and to demand sound monetary policy, we're going to have an administration that cares about it. I'll also point out something that worries me about the Fed in particular is the threats and rumblings we're seeing of the Fed rolling out a central bank digital currency. I'm a big believer in Bitcoin and the potential of crypto. I'm very grateful that Texas is really becoming an oasis for Bitcoin mining, and it's something we welcome. We've got an abundance of low-cost energy. I think there are lots of reasons people are attracted to Bitcoin and more broadly to crypto, but I think one of the reasons is as a hedge against inflation because they don't trust the Fed. They don't trust that U.S. dollars are going to remain a constant store of value, and so they're looking for an alternative. They're looking for the equivalent of digital gold. And I think if the Fed were to give in to the desires of Elizabeth Warren and the radical left wing and issue a central bank digital currency, that would be profoundly dangerous. And it would open up the American people and your financial transactions to incredible monitoring and spying by the federal government, which I think is...
And possibly repeat the mistake of fiat money in the
Yes,
first instance.
exactly. Yeah.
Let me pivot for a little bit about to foreign policy. There's been news out of Iran and out of Israel about a discovery of a new nuclear site at Natanz. What should we be doing right now? You're hearing more rumblings about Israel's leaders talking to their people about the possibility of significant military action. Should America be involved in that? How can America be supportive of that?
Well, look, on Israel and Iran, I think America should reverse our policy entirely. The Biden administration, their policy is exactly backwards. For 2.5 years, Joe Biden and the Democrats have alienated and abandoned our friends and allies across the globe, and they've consistently shown weakness and appeasement towards our enemies. As it concerns Israel, I'm very concerned by the Biden administration's constant efforts to undermine the state of Israel, and in particular to undermine Prime Minister Netanyahu, whom they loathe and despise. Biden has said he refuses to meet with Netanyahu, that he will not be invited to the White House. Mind you, Biden will invite Lula, a left-wing dictator who toppled Bolsonaro, a friend that wanted Brazil to be friends with America, and yet Biden didn't want a friend in the largest country in Latin America.
Do you have a stance on the judicial reform in Israel?
My stance is it's a question for the voters of Israel to decide. And I am a big fan of Prime Minister Netanyahu. I know Bibi well. I've spent a lot of time with him. I understand why he's pushing it. I don't think my jumping in the middle of that issue is appropriate or particularly helpful. Now, that being said, I think the Biden White House actively stirring up the left-wing protest against Bibi is wholly inappropriate. It is not our business to be messing in internal electoral matters within the state of Israel. And look, the folks in the Biden administration are the same carryover folks from the Obama administration who actively helped fund and organize campaigns against Netanyahu. And so they're more than willing to undermine the Israeli government. At the same time, as it concerns Iran, the number one foreign policy objective of the Biden administration is re-entering an Iran nuclear deal, no matter how bad the terms are. And when it comes to Iran, the directions, Joe Biden has already refused to enforce the oil sanctions. He's allowing the Ayatollah to sell 1 million barrels of oil a day. That is funding the regime. By the way, the billions of dollars Iran is making from that, much of that is going into developing drones. Those drones, in turn, are going to Russia, and the Russian soldiers are using them to attack Ukrainian soldiers and citizens. So the Biden administration is literally funding both sides of the war on Ukraine. It is madness, but the reason is, as much as some members of the Biden administration might hope to win the war in Ukraine, they care much more about entering an Iran deal, and they're willing to look the other way as Iran is the number one supplier of lethal weapons to Russia, and those weapons are being used to kill Ukrainians.
Let me ask you about another potential conflict related to that war in Ukraine, and that is Taiwan and China.
Yes.
And you know the war in Russia is in Ukraine is now well underway. Potential conflict there has not yet begun. What is your stance about where we should be and kind of what we can do now?
We should stand absolutely with Taiwan, and I am deeply concerned about the risk of conflict between China and Taiwan. You know,
is standing with Taiwan more likely to precipitate that conflict or more likely to ward it off?
I think the objection should be deterrence to prevent a Chinese military attack. I believe in peace through strength, which Reagan exemplified powerfully. That means we're very reluctant to send in the Marines. It's worth noting the biggest country Reagan ever invaded was Grenada. He did not believe in toppling foreign governments to try to create democracies across the globe. He understood that our military's job is to protect the United States of America and protect our citizens. But he also understood that weakness is provocative, and that if we are strong enough, our enemies will not be able to stand up to us. Remember, Reagan won the Cold War without firing a shot. When you look at Taiwan, Joe Biden's incredible weakness and appeasement, and it started most dramatically with Afghanistan, with the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, the surrender to the Taliban. It was incompetently executed, including giving up the Bagram airfield, the secure airfield, before the evacuation, which meant we didn't have a secure airfield to conduct the evacuation, which meant that 13 American servicemen and women were murdered by a suicide bomber, which meant that we left Americans behind, we left Afghans who had assisted us behind. That disaster in Afghanistan, what I said at the time, is every enemy of America has looked at what has happened, has looked at the Oval Office, and they've taken a measure of the man, and they've concluded that the commander-in-chief is weak and feckless and ineffective. And I said at the time, the chances of Russia invading Ukraine have risen tenfold, and the chances of China invading Taiwan have risen tenfold. The first has come to pass. The second may still. I will say this, though. The fact that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has gone so badly for Putin has decreased the likelihood of an invasion of Taiwan. I think Xi is watching very closely. And when the Ukraine war started, I still remember the Biden administration, we had long classified briefings, where they presented their assessment, and this was the assessment of state, of intelligence, of DOD, of all of the Biden administration. They said this war will be over in a week. Putin will sweep in, he will just run over the country, Ukraine will surrender, it'll be over. Remember, Biden offered Zelensky, hey, do you want us to fly you out of the country? And Zelensky, in words that I think will go down in history, said, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition.
Right.
The fact that the Ukrainians have fought so vigorously.
F-16s?
Yes. And part of the problem, all right, let's focus on Ukraine for a minute. Number one, what's so frustrating about this war is it's unnecessary. It didn't have to happen. The war in Ukraine was caused by Joe Biden's weakness. And in particular, look, Putin has long wanted to invade Ukraine. He has stated he wants to reassemble the old Soviet Union. To do so, Ukraine is the most critical part of that. And he did invade Ukraine in 2014. He invaded Crimea, the southern portion. He stopped because the Russian natural gas runs on pipelines through Ukraine to Europe. Their revenue depends on that natural gas, and he couldn't risk endangering those pipelines. What did he do the next year? 2015, Putin began building Nord Stream 2, undersea pipeline running from Russia to Germany to circumvent Ukraine. The entire purpose of Nord Stream 2 was once it was complete and operational, Putin could invade Ukraine and not worry about the pipelines. In 2019, I authored and passed bipartisan legislation, sanctions, shutting down Nord Stream 2. And Putin stopped construction of the pipeline the day President Trump signed my sanctions legislation into law. We had stopped the pipeline, and as long as Nord Stream 2 was stopped, Russia would not invade Ukraine. Joe Biden became president January 20th, 2021. Putin resumed deep-sea construction of Nord Stream 2 4 days later. January 24th. And it's because Biden had foreshadowed what he was going to do, which is waive the sanctions on Russia, waive the sanctions on Putin, give Putin a multi-billion-dollar gift. And because of Biden's weakness, he let Biden complete Nord Stream 2. And what happened is exactly what we said would happen. Russia invaded Ukraine almost immediately thereafter.
Let me ask a question of a more personal nature. How are you feeling about your race? And let me ask a second question. And what do you see as Texas's political future? I mean, all eyes in the nation have been on your races. One, because you're of interest, but two, I think people see in your political career sort of a harbinger of sort of the larger narrative around Texas. So give us kind of the view from your office and then the view from Texas.
Sure. So I'm running for re-election to the Senate in 2024. And we're expecting a real fight. We know the Democrats have laid out this race as their number one target to try to pick up a seat. Chuck Schumer has targeted Texas in particular. My last re-election in 2018, at the time, was the most expensive Senate race in U.S. history. We were outraised and outspent 3-1. Democrats flooded cash into the state of Texas trying to take me out. And they more than doubled Democrat turnout in Texas. It was a massive turnout operation. They brought Democrat turnout from 1.8 million all the way up to 4 million. We saw that coming. We leaned in hard, and we drove Republican turnout from 2.8 million up to 4.2 million. But 0.2 was the whole margin. I won by 200,000 votes out of more than 8 million votes cast. The margin was 2.6%. And already my likely Democrat opponent is a congressman named Colin Allred, who is a very liberal Democrat from Dallas. He's a former NFL player. In his first 36 hours in the race, he raised over $2 million. His voting record his first 4 years in Congress was identical to Nancy Pelosi's, 100%, literally did not disagree on a single issue. He's already been endorsed by J Street. His record on everything is on the extreme left. But the Democrats are going to flood cash into this race. And at some level, look, if you're a Democrat, after Donald Trump, there's nobody in the country you want to beat more than me. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to see $100 million or more come in against us. Now, fortunately, we're getting people from all over the country. They're going to our website, tedcruz.org. That's tedcruz.org. And they're making contributions. And it's, we will win in Texas, but we'll win for the same reason that I've won every previous election, because the grassroots, the people of Texas, want a senator who fights for them, who fights for their jobs, who fights for their freedom, who fights for their security. Are you happy with your job in the Senate? I love it. Ari, I jump out of bed every morning. And the reason is simple. Look, the stakes we're facing have never been higher. I've never seen a 2-year period in our nation's history where an administration has done more damage to America than what the Biden administration has done in the last 2 years. This White House has gone to the extreme left. The people setting the agenda are Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and AOC. And so I view my job in the Senate, it's like the Roman Colosseum, where I strap on my armor, I grab a battle axe, and I go fight the barbarians. My job every day is to stop dumbass policies coming out of Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and the Senate Democrats. And it is, to use a military analogy, it is a target-rich environment.
Are you happy with the Republican field so far for president?
I'm staying out of that. Look, I think the race is effectively a two-man race on the Republican side between Trump and DeSantis. I'm friends with President Trump. I'm friends with Ron DeSantis. I think highly of them both. I think the two of them are going to beat the living daylights out of each other. And I think it'll be the voters who will decide. Whoever wins, I'm going to support vigorously to beat Joe Biden, because I think the path we're on is disastrous for America. And I think the American people want to change the road we're on.
Senator Cruz, thank you for joining the New York Sun.
Appreciate it.